I actually kind of wonder what some of this stuff will look like. I wonder. Oh, that's kind of cool. And how well, just because.
I'm going to eat your soul.
Anyways, welcome. This is another scary Octoberish reading of Joe the Masks. This time from my book of Irish ghost stories. This is The Eyes of the Dead by Daniel Corkery. If he had not put it off for 3 years, John Spillin's homecoming would have been that of a famous man. Bonfires would have been lighted on the hilltops of Rosemary, and the ships passing by 20 miles out would have wondered what they had meant. 3 years ago, the Western Star, an Atlantic liner, one night tore her iron plates to pieces against the cliff-like face of an iceberg, and in less than an hour sank in the waters. Of the 789 human souls aboard her, only one had been saved. John Spillancy. Why did they spell his name different in two different ones? Oh well. John Spillancy, able seaman, of Rosemary in the country of Cork. The name of the little fishing village, his own name, his picture, were all in the papers of the world. It seemed, not only because he alone had escaped, but by reason of the manner of that escape. He had clung to a bit of drift of wreckage. Most have lost consciousness for more than a whole day. Floated, then about on the ocean for a second day, for a second night, and had arrived at the threshold of another dreadful night when he was finally rescued. A fog was coming down on the waters. It frightened him more than the darkness. He raised a shout. He kept on shouting. When safe in the arms of his rescuers, his breathy, almost inaudible voice was still forcing out some cry, which they interpreted as help, help. That was what he had struck the imagination of men, the half-insane figure sending his cry over the waste of waters, the fog thickening and the night falling. Although the whole world had read also of the groping rescue ship, of Spillan's bursts of hysteric laughter, of his inability to tell his story until he had slept 18 hours on end. What remained in the memory was the lonely figure sending his cry over the sea. And then, almost before his picture had disappeared from the papers, he had lost himself in the great cities of the States. To Rosemary no word had come from himself, not for a long time from any acquaintance. But then, when about a year had gone by, his sister or mother, as they sent up the road to Mass of a Sunday, might be stopped and informed in a whispering voice that John had been seen in Chicago, or it might be in New York, or Boston, or San Francisco, or indeed anywhere. And from the meagerness of the messages it was known, with only too much certainty, that he had not, in exchanging sea for land, bettered his lot. If once again his people had happened on such empty tidings of him, one would knew it by their bowed and stilly attitude in the little church as the light whisper of the Mass rose and fell about them. When 3 years had gone by, he lifted the latch of his mother's house one October evening, and stood awkwardly in the middle of the floor. It was nightfall, and not a soul had seen him break down from the ridge and across the roadway. He had come secretly from the ends of the earth, and before he was an hour in the midst, he rose up impatiently, timidly, and stole into his bed. "I don't want any light," he said, and as his mother left him there in the dark, she heard him yield his whole being to a sigh of thankfulness. Before that he had told them he felt tired, a natural thing, since he had tramped 15 miles from the railway station in Skibbereen. But day followed day without his showing any desire to rise from the bedclothes and go aboard among the people. He had had enough of the sea, it seemed, enough too of the great cities of the States. He was a pity, the neighbors said, and the few of them who from time to time caught glimpses of him reported him as not yet having lost the scared look that the ocean had left on him. His hair was gray, or nearly gray, and swept back fiercely from his forehead, a fashion strange to the place. seemed to pull his eyes open to keep them wide open as he looked at you. His mustache was also gray, they said, and his cheeks were gray too, sunken and dark with shadows. Yet his mother and sister, the only others in the house, were glad to have him back with them. At any rate, they said, they now knew where he was. They found nothing wrong with him. Of speech, neither he nor they ever had the gift. And as day followed day and week, the same few phrases could carry them through the day and into the silence of the night. In the beginning they had thought it natural to speak with him about the wreck. Soon, however, they came to know that it was a subject for which he had no welcome. In the beginning also they had thought to rouse him by bringing the neighbor to his side. But such visits, instead of cheering him, only left him sunken in silence, almost in despair. The priest came to see him once in a while, and advised the mother and sister, Mary her name was, to treat him as normally as they could, letting on that his useless presence was no affliction to them, nor even a burden. That was too far. In time, John Spillane was accepted by all as one of those unseen ones, or seldom seen ones, who are to be found in every village in the world. The bedridden, the struck down, the aged, forgotten of all except the few faithful creatures that bring the cup to the bedside of a morning and open the curtains to let in the sun. In the nearest house, distant a quarter-mile from them, lived Tom Lean. In the old days, before John Spleen went to sea, Tom had been his companion, and now of a night-time he would drop in if he had any story worth telling of, or in the day following. He chanced to by going to Skibbereen, where he might buy the Spleens such goods as they needed, or sell a pig for them, slipping it in among his own. He was a quiet creature, married, and struggling to bring up the little family that was thickening about him. In the Spleens he would, dragging at the pipe, sit on the settle, and quietly gossip with the old woman, while Mary moved about on the flags, putting the household quite tidy for the night. But all three of them, as they kept up the talk, were never unaware of the silent listener in the lower room. Of that room the door was kept open, but no lamp was lighted within it. No lamp indeed was needed, for a shaft of light from the kitchen struck it into showing one or two of the religious pictures on the wall, and giving sufficient light to move about in. Sometimes the conversation would drift away from the neighborly doings, for even in Rosmeria tidings from the great world abroad would sometimes come. In the middle of such gossip, however, a sodden thought would strike Tom Lean, and raising his voice, he would blurt out, "But sure 'tis foolish for the like of me to be talking about those far-off places, and that man inside after travelling the world over and thither." The man inside, however, would give no sign whatever whether the gossip had been wise or foolish. They might hear the bed creak, as if he had turned with impatience at their mentioning of his very presence. There had been a spell of stormy weather. It was now the middle of February, and for the last 5 days at twilight the gale seemed always to set in for a night of it. Although there was scarcely a house around that part of the southwest Irish coast that had not come with some of its members, husband or brother or son, who lived in the sea, sailing abroad or fishing the home waters or those of the Isle of Man. In no other house was the strain of a spell of disasters weathered so noticeably in the face of its inmates. The old woman, withdrawn into herself, would handle her beads all day long, her voice every now and then raising itself in forgetfulness to a sort of moan not unlike the winds, upon which the younger woman would chide her with a "shh, shh," and bend vigorously upon her work to keep bitterness from her thoughts. At such times she might enter her brother's room, and find him raised on his elbows in the bed, listening to the howling winds, scared it seemed, his eyes fixed and wide open. He would drink the warm milk she had brought him, and hand the vessel back without a word, and in the selfsame attitude she would leave him. The 5th night, instead of growing in loudness and fierceness, the wind died away somewhat. It became fretful, promising the end of the storm, and before long they could distinguish between the continuous groanings and pounding of the sea and the sudden shout the dying tempest would fling among the tree-tops of the rocks. They were thankful to note such signs of relief. The daughter became more active, and the mother put by her beads. In the midst of a sudden sally of the winds, the latch was raised, and Tom Lean gave them a greeting. His face was rosy and glowing under his sou'wester. His eyes were sparkling from the sting of the salty gusts. To see him, so sane, so healthy, was to them like a blessing. "How is it with ye?" he said, cheerfully, closing the door to. Good then," they answered him, and the mother rose almost as if she would take him by the hand. The reply meant that nothing unforeseen had befallen them. He understood as much. He shook a silent head in the direction of the listener's room, a look of inquiry in his eyes, and his look Mary answered with a sort of hopeless upswing of her face. Things had not improved in the lower room. The wind died away more and more, and after some time streamed by with a shrill, steady undersong. All through, however, the crashing of the sea on the jagged rocks beneath kept up an unceasing clamor. Tom had a whole budget of news for them. Finney's barn had been stripped of its roof, a window in the chapel had been blown in, and Largy's store of fodder had been shredded in the wind. It littered all the bushes to the east. There were rumors of a wreck somewhere, but it was too soon yet to know what damage the sea had done in its 5 days of madness. The news he had brought them did not matter. What mattered was his company. The knitting of their half-distraught household, once again to humankind. Even when at last he stood up to go, their spirits did not droop. So great had been the restoration. "We're finished with it for a while anyhow," Tom said, rising for home. We are, and who knows, it mightn't be after doing all the damage we think." He shut the door behind him. The two women had turned towards the fire when they thought they again heard his voice outside. They wondered at the sound. They listened for his footsteps, still staring at the closed door. Once more they heard his voice. This time they were sure. The door reopened, and he backed in, as one does from an unexpected slap of rain in the face. The light struck outwards, and they saw a white face advancing. Some anxiety, some uncertainty in Tom's attitude, as he backed away from the advancing face, involved them so that they too became afraid. They saw the stranger also hesitating, looking down his own limbs. His clothes were dripping as they clung in about him. He was bareheaded. When he raised his face again, it looked as full of apology. His features were large and flat and gray as a stone. Every now and then a spasm went through him, and they wondered what it meant. His clav of a mouth hung open. His unshaven chin trembled. Tom spoke to him. "You better come in, but there's many another house that would probably suit you better than this." They heard a husky, scarce audible voice reply, "A doghouse would do, or a stable." Barely enough, he made an effort to smile. "Oh, isn't that at all? But come in." He stepped in, slowly and heavily, again glancing down his limbs. The water running from his clothes spread in a black pool on the flags. The young woman began to touch him with her fingertips, as with some instinctive sympathy, yet could not think, it seemed, that was best to be done. The mother, however, vigorously set the fire wheel at work, and Tom built up the fire with bog timber and turf. The stranger, meanwhile, stood as if half dazed. At last, as Mary, with a candle in her hand, stood pulling out dry clothes from a press, he blurted out in the same husky voice, Welsh in accent, "I think I'm the only one." They understood the significance of the words, but it seemed wrong to do so. "What is it you're saying?" Mary said, but one would not have recognized the voice for hers. It was so toneless. He raised a heavy sailor's hand in an awkward taproom gesture. "The others, they're gone. All of them." The spasm again crossed his homely features, and his hand fell. He bowed his head. A coldness went through him. They stared at him. He might have thought them inhuman, but Mary suddenly pulled herself together, leaping at him almost. "Shh, shh," she said. Speak low, low." And as she spoke, all earnestness, she towed him first in the distant direction of the fire, and then away from it. Hazardly, it seemed, she turned from him and whispered to Tom, "Look, take him up into the loft, and he can change his clothes. Take these with you, and the candle, the candle." And she searched him the candle, and she reached him the candle eagerly. Tom led the stranger up the stairs. It was more like a ladder, and the two of them disappeared into the loft. The old woman whispered, "What was it he said?" "Just how his ship is sunk." "Did he say he was the only one?" "He said that." "Did himself hear him?" She nodded towards her son's room. "No. Didn't you see me pulling him away from it? But he'll hear him now. Isn't it a wonder Tom wouldn't have walked easy on the boards?" No answer from the old woman. She had deliberately seated herself in her accustomed place at the fire, and now moaned out, "Aren't we in a cruel way, not knowing how he'd take a thing? Am I better tell him there's a poor seaman after coming in on us? Did you hear him above? Did you hear them?" In the loft the men's feet were loud on the boards. The voice they half expected to hear had they heard break in the clatter of the boots above. "Mother, mother." "Yes, child, yes." "Who's aloft? Who's going around like that? Or is it dreaming I am?" The sounds from above were certainly like that one hears in a ship. They thought of this, but they also felt something terrible in the voice that had been waiting for. They hardly knew it for the voice of the man that had been listening to for 5 months. "Go in and tell him the truth," the mother whispered. "Who are we to know what's right to be done? Let God have the doing of it." She threw her hands in the air. Mary went in to her brother, and her limbs were weak and cold. The old woman remained seated at the fire, swung around from it, her eyes towards her son's room, fixed, as the head itself was fixed, in the tension of anxiety. After a few minutes, Mary emerged from a strange alertness upon her. "He's rising. He's getting up. 'Tis his place, he says. He's quite good." She meant he seemed bright and well, the mother said. "We'll take no notice of him, only just as if he was always with us." "Yes, yes." They were glad then to hear the two men in the loft groping for the stair ahead. The kettle began to splutter in the boil, and Mary busied herself with the table and teacups. The sailor came down, all smiles in his ill-fitting hazard clothes. He looked so overjoyed one might think he would presumably burst into song. "The fire is good," he said. "It's put life in one, and the dry clothes too. My word, I'm thankful to you. Good people, I'm thankful to you." He shook hands with them all effusively. "Well, sit down now and drink up the tea." "I can't figure it out. Less than 2 hours ago out there." As he spoke, he raised his hand towards the little porthole of a window, looking at them with his eyes staring. "Don't be thinking of anything, but drink up the hot tea," Mary said. He nodded and set to eat with a vigor. Yet suddenly he would stop, as if he were ashamed of it, turn half round, and look at them with beaming eyes, looking from one to another and back again, and they affably would nod back at him. "Excuse me, people," he would say. "Excuse me." He had not the gift of speech, and his too full heart could not declare itself. To make him feel at ease, Tom Lean sat down away from him, and the women began to find something to do about the room. Then there were only little sounds in the room, the breaking of the eggs, the turning of the fire wheel, the wind blowing by. The door of the lower room opened silently, so silently that none of them heard it. And before they were aware, the son of the house, with his clothes flung on loosely, was standward awkwardly in the middle of the floor, looking down on the back of the sailorman bent above the table. "This is my son," the mother thought of saying. "He was after going to bed when you came in." The Welshman leapt to his feet, and impulsively, yet without many words, shook John Spielin by the hand, thanking him and all the household. As he seated himself again at the table, John made his way silently towards the settle, from which, across the room, he could see the sailor as he bent over his meal. The stranger put the cup away from him. He could take no more, and Tom Lane and the womenfolk tried to keep him in talk, avoiding, as by some mutual understanding, the mention of what he had come through. The eyes of the son of the house were all the time fiercely buried in him. There came a moment's silence in the general chatter, a moment it seemed impossible to fill, and the sailorman swung his chair half around from the table, a spoon held in his hand lightly. "I can't figure it out. I can't know how figure it out. Here I am, full filled like a prize beast, and warm. Oh, but I'm thankful. And all my mates," with the spoon he was pointing towards the sea, "white and cold like dead fish. I can't figure it out." To their astonishment, a voice travelled across the room from the settle. "Is it how ye struck?" "Struck? 3 times we struck. We struck last night, about this time last night, and off we went in a puff. Fine, we said. We struck again. 'Twas just coming light, and off again. But when we struck the 3rd time, 'twas like that. He clapped his hands together. She went in matchwood. 'Twas dark. Why, it can't be 2 hours since. She went to pieces? The same voice questioned him. The Gnaw Titty went to pieces, sir. No one knew what had happened or where he was. 'Twas too sudden. I found myself clung about a snag of rock. I hugged it. He stood up, hoisted us from within. Is it you that was on the lookout? Me? Oh, we'd all been on the lookout for 3 days. My word, yes, 3 days. We were stupefied with it. They were looking at him as he spoke, and they saw the shiver again cross his features. The strength and warmth that the food and comfort had given him had all fallen from him, and he became in an instant the half-drowned man who had stepped into them the night with the clothes sagging about his limbs. 'Twas bad clinging to that rock, with them all gone. 'Twas lonely. Do you know, I was so frightened I couldn't call out. John Spillane stood up slowly, as if he too were being hoisted from within. Were they looking at you? Who? The rest of them. The eyes of them. No, the voice had dropped. No, I didn't think of that. The two of them stared as if fascinated by each other. You didn't? It seemed that John Spillane had lost the purpose of his questioning. His voice was thin and weak, but he was still staring with unmoving, puzzled eyes at the stranger's face. The abashed creature before him had suddenly seemed to gain as much eagerness as he had lost. His words were hot with anxiety to express himself adequately. But now, isn't it curious? As I sat there at the table, I thought somehow they would walk in. That would be right for them, somehow, to walk in, all of them. His words, his eagerness, lowered voice, brought in the darkness outside, its vastness, its terror. They seemed in the midst of an unsubstantial world. They feared that the latch would lift, yet dared not glance at it, lest they should invite the lifting. But it was all one to the son of the house. He appeared to have gone away into some mood of his own. His eyes were glaring, not looking at anything or anyone, close at hand. With an instinctive groping for comfort, they all, except him, began to stir, to find some little homely task to do. Mary handled the tea-ware, Tom his pipe, when a rambling voice, very indistinct, stilled them all again. Words, phrases, began to reach them. That a man's eyes will close, and he, on the lookout, close in spite of himself. That it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair, it wasn't fair. And lost in his agony, he began to glide through them, explaining, excusing the terror that was to him. All around, staring at me, blaming me, a sea of them, far, far, without a word of them, only their eyes in the darkness, pale like candles. Transfixed, they glared at him, at his rounded-shouldered sailor's back disappearing into his den of refuge. They could not hear his voice any more, and they were afraid to follow him. That would be hard to live with. That would be very hard to live with. Not just the survivor's shock of having survived and all your friends died, but have that guilt of you closed your eyes while on lookout, and that's the reason why they all died, because you weren't there to call out Glacier. It's a bit of a haunting. It's a little different than, the normal scary stories, but it is definitely a haunting. Definitely a haunting.